In July 1945, the USS Indianapolis slipped out of San Francisco, carrying a cargo so secret even the crew wasn't told what it was, only that it had to reach the Pacific fast. Days later, the ship was sailing alone in the dark when two torpedoes hit. She sank in 12 minutes. Nearly 900 men went into the water. No distress call brought help. For 4 days they fought sun, thirst, saltwater madness, and sharks, while the Navy didn't even know they were missing. In the final summer of the Pacific War, when the machinery of victory had become so vast and secretive that most of the men turning its gears could no longer see the shape of the thing they served, the USS Indianapolis took aboard a cargo in San Francisco that was guarded more closely than gold. Marines stood watch over sealed containers hoisted into the ship under a level of urgency that suggested not merely importance, but consequence. The officers were told little. The enlisted men were told nothing. They understood only that they were carrying something the Navy wanted moved quickly, and that speed itself had become a form of obedience. The Indianapolis was a heavy cruiser, long and lean, built for force and distance, a ship that could move fast enough to feel almost alive beneath a man's feet. Her hull ran more than 600 feet from bow to stern. Her engines could shove her across the Pacific at a pace few warships of her size could sustain. She had already seen combat, had already absorbed punishment, had already become part of the hard arithmetic by which the United States was strangling the Japanese Empire. By July 1945, everybody understood the war was nearing its end. But endings in war are rarely gentle. They are often the bloodiest part. Captain Charles B. McVay III took the cruiser out at high speed. She crossed to Pearl Harbor in a little over 3 days, paused only long enough to refuel, and then ran on toward Tinian in the Marianas, where the cargo was offloaded under such secrecy that even decades later, men would still speak of it with the caution of those who had once been warned to forget what they saw. Only later did the crew learn what they had delivered: components for the atomic bomb that would destroy Hiroshima. At the time, all they knew was that they had been used for something large and hidden and irreversible. After Tinian came fresh orders: steam to Guam, then continue on to Leyte in the Philippines to join other forces for training. It sounded routine, and routine in wartime could be more dangerous than fear, because routine dulled the edge of imagination. The Indianapolis left Guam on July 28th without an escort. No destroyers screened her flanks. No submarine hunters paced ahead. She moved alone across a broad reach of sea the Navy had judged relatively safe. That judgment was wrong. Late on July 29th, as daylight drained from the sky and the surface of the Philippine Sea darkened into that deceptive calm that so often precedes catastrophe, McVay studied the weather and the visibility. His orders gave him discretion about zigzagging, the defensive maneuver intended to complicate a submarine's firing solution. Zigzag when conditions permitted, he had been told. The sea had become difficult to read. Clouds moved across the moon. Visibility came and went. McVay decided to stop zigzagging. It was the kind of decision officers make all the time, the kind that seems entirely reasonable until history hardens around it and declares that some other choice, invisible at the moment, would have changed everything. Most human beings are judged by the motives behind their decisions. Commanding officers are often judged by outcomes alone. Not far away, unseen in the dark water, Commander Mochitsura Hashimoto of the Japanese submarine I-58 was watching through a periscope. He had found what every submariner hunts for: a large target silhouetted at night, moving on a steady course. Hashimoto maneuvered carefully, taking the ship's bearing and speed, letting the geometry of destruction solve itself in his mind. The Indianapolis went on through the darkness, her crew changing watches, writing notes, smoking, trying to sleep in the oppressive heat, carrying on in that familiar, half-alert rhythm of men who have spent too many months at sea to be startled by every shadow. Just after midnight on July 30th, Hashimoto fired. The torpedoes crossed the water in seconds. On board the Indianapolis, there was no warning, no glimpse of a wake in time to matter. At 12:14 a.m., the first torpedo struck the starboard bow with such force that men asleep in their bunks were thrown upward before they were fully awake. The ship lurched. Steel ruptured. Compartments burst open to the sea. Almost immediately, a second torpedo hit farther aft, near vital engineering spaces and fuel. This blast was worse. It tore through the ship's insides and sent fire surging through passageways. Aviation fuel ignited. Electrical systems failed. Lights vanished. Telephones died. In some compartments, men were plunged into total darkness. In others, they were trapped in a furnace. Those who survived the first moments found themselves inside a world that had ceased to obey the rules of ordinary life. Corridors filled with smoke and flame. Ladders became chimneys. Water poured through ruptured seams, and doors that had held against weather and battle, but could not hold against this. Men clawed their way upward by memory and instinct. Some burned. Some drowned before they understood what was happening. Some never had time to be afraid. The ship was mortally damaged from the start. Her bow flooded rapidly. Her list increased with appalling speed. Captain McVeigh ordered abandon ship, but with communications wrecked, that order reached only a fraction of the crew in any organized way. Many men never heard it. They only sensed, as animals do, that the structure around them had lost its integrity and that staying inside meant death. The Indianapolis sank in about 12 minutes. It happened so fast that there was no meaningful lowering of boats, no orderly evacuation, no sequence that could be mistaken for control. Men went over the side in life jackets, in kapok floats, on scraps of wreckage. Others were carried into the sea when the deck tilted beyond standing. The cruiser rolled hard, exposing parts of herself no one should ever see above water, and then she went down, bow first. Survivors later described the sounds: the shriek of metal under impossible strain, the thunder of collapsing compartments, the hiss and roar of trapped air escaping through the body of a dying ship. Then there was only ocean, burning oil, wreckage, and men calling out in the dark. Roughly 300 sailors died with the ship, or in the first minutes afterward. Around 900 made it into the water. They were spread over miles of open sea, many of them coated in bunker oil so thick it blackened their skin and turned every face into a grotesque mask, with only the whites of the eyes and the red of the mouth showing through. Dawn revealed the scale of the disaster. There was no land, no passing vessel, no rescue on the horizon. Only clusters of men rising and falling in a warm blue emptiness that seemed, at first glance, almost benign. But warm water can kill slowly, and isolation kills in layers. At first, the survivors assumed help would come. They were in the Navy, after all. A heavy cruiser had vanished. Distress calls had surely gone out. Somebody would be looking. Men formed groups because human beings group together under threat almost automatically. They counted one another. They called names. Officers and petty officers tried to establish a shape of authority in conditions that made authority feel almost imaginary. Dr. Lewis Haynes, the ship's medical officer, moved among men in the water, doing what doctors always do when there is little they can actually fix. He offered warnings, reassurance, and the appearance of steadiness. The appearance mattered. Survival often begins as theater. One man acts calm so the next man won't panic, and the second man steadies a third, and in this way, a small fiction of order pushes back against chaos. The oil that coated many of them was miserable to endure, But it had an unintended benefit. It shielded skin from the full blast of the tropical sun. Even so, the men were in bad shape from the beginning. Many had burns from the explosions and fires. Many had swallowed fuel oil. Nearly all were vomiting. The sea was warm enough to feel tolerable in the short term, but not warm enough to prevent the steady theft of body heat. A man's core temperature does not negotiate with tropical scenery. After enough hours in water, strength leaves him. The first day was still governed by hope. The second day began to belong to thirst. Their torments the body can absorb into a kind of numb endurance, and there are others that strip away reason itself. Thirst is one of the latter. Fresh water became the organizing fact of every waking thought. Men's tongues swelled, their lips split, their throats felt scraped raw. Haynes and others warned them not to drink seawater. The warning was correct and almost impossible to obey. Seawater intensified dehydration, poisoned judgment, and opened the door to delirium. Men who drank it became restless, then irrational, then detached from reality altogether. They saw islands, they saw ships, they saw lights, buildings, families, food. They became certain of things that did not exist and swam toward them with a doomed conviction that could not be argued away. Some of the younger sailors were the first to go. They still possessed the energy to act on their hallucinations. Older men, or those already weakened, sometimes survived longer simply because they lacked the strength to chase a vision. Then there were the sharks. In the popular memory of the Indianapolis, the sharks often occupy center stage, as though this were primarily a story of teeth and blood. That is understandable. The image is too primal to ignore. Men alone in the open Pacific, fins cutting the surface, cries in the dark. Oceanic whitetips and other sharks did, in fact, gather. The explosions, the sinking, the blood, the bodies, all of it summoned them. Survivors saw dorsal fins moving through the swells. They watched sharks take the dead, and at times, the living. A scream would tear across the water. A man would vanish. A life jacket might surface without the man who had filled it. These scenes seared themselves into memory with a force beyond proportion, because terror compresses perception. A single shark attack could eclipse hours of lesser suffering, and yet the sharks were not the principal executioners. Exposure, dehydration, injuries, saltwater poisoning, and the collapse of human coherence killed more men than the predators circling beneath them. The sharks were real. But worse, in a way, was the long attrition of mind and body. The survivors tried to preserve order. Ensign Harlan Twible, a young officer suddenly responsible for hundreds of men in the water, attempted to keep his group together and hopeful. Father Thomas Conway, the Catholic chaplain, moved among the sailors offering prayers and words that did not change the facts, but helped some endure them. Captain McVeigh, afloat with a small cluster of men and a raft, continued to command as best he could, because command does not disappear when the ship does. It merely becomes more tragic. While these men fought minute by minute to remain alive, the Navy failed them in ways that were both mundane and devastating. Distress signals from the Indianapolis had, in fact, been received by multiple stations. One officer suspected a Japanese trick and did nothing. At another station, the commanding officer was unavailable, and subordinates failed to escalate the report. Elsewhere, the message was mishandled, dismissed, or allowed to die inside the machinery of wartime procedure. When the ship did not arrive in Leyte on schedule, nobody raised the alarm. Assumptions filled the space where action should have been. Perhaps she had been diverted. Perhaps someone else was tracking her. Perhaps. Bureaucracy often kills not through malice, but through diffusion of responsibility so complete that no individual feels the full weight of inaction. So the men floated through a second night, then a third day, then a third night. Time in such circumstances ceases to move like time. It stretches and folds. A single hour can feel geological. A whole day can disappear into a fever of thirst, fear, and exhaustion. Skin softened and peeled from immersion. Wounds turned angry and white. Muscles cramped. Minds slipped. Men clung to one another not only for physical support, but to stay tethered to a shared reality. If enough of your shipmates insisted the island on the horizon was imaginary, you might still doubt them. If enough of them began to behave as though rescue was just over there, visible only to the elect, madness could become communal. By August 1st, hallucinations were widespread. Some men believed they saw the Indianapolis whole and waiting. Some saw cities beneath the water. Some saw loved ones calling to them. Once, a man left the group and started swimming toward one of these apparitions. There was often little anyone could do. He would wave them off impatiently, as though they were fools who could not see what was plainly before him. Then, distance would take him, or darkness, or a shark, or simple exhaustion. The sea erased these departures quickly. Against this, acts of decency acquired unusual force. Men shared scraps of encouragement that, under normal circumstances, might have sounded laughably thin. They held up the weak. They argued against despair. They repeated rumors of rescue, because rumors, in a survival situation, can function as medicine. Even false hope has nutritional value for a while. On the fourth day, August 2nd, chance intervened where systems had failed. A patrol plane flown by Lieutenant Wilbur Gwynn happened to spot an oil slick broad enough to attract suspicion. He descended to investigate and saw men in the water. Far too many men, spread far too widely, in a configuration that could only mean catastrophe. Gwynn radioed the sighting, and suddenly, the machinery that had ignored the sinking shuddered to life. Aircraft converged, ships were dispatched. But for many survivors, official help was still hours away, and hours were something they did not all possess. Lieutenant Robert Adrian Marks, flying a PBY Catalina, arrived over the scene and looked down on what remained of the crew. He could have obeyed orders and circled until surface ships arrived. Instead, he chose a more dangerous form of mercy. He landed the aircraft in the open sea, a maneuver considered far too risky in those swells. The Catalina slammed hard against the water, but held together. Marks and his crew began hauling survivors aboard. Soon, the plane was overloaded. There was no room left inside, so they did something improvisational and astonishing. They tied men to the wings with parachute cord to keep them out of the water until destroyers arrived. It was an act that seems, in retrospect, almost symbolic. After 4 days of abandonment, men were at last being physically attached to rescue. Destroyers reached the area by late afternoon and evening. The USS Cecil J. Doyle and others began pulling survivors from the water, one by one. As darkness fell, the Doyle turned its searchlight across the sea, illuminating the slick and the floating men in a harsh white beam that survivors remembered as something close to divine. After days in an indifferent universe of blue water and blazing sky, here was a human light sweeping toward them, deliberate and searching. By the time the rescue was complete, only 316 men remained alive. The loss was staggering. Of the nearly 1,200 aboard, most were dead. Some had gone down with the ship. Hundreds more had survived the sinking only to perish in the water, while the Navy remained unaware or failed to understand that they were there. For the rescued men, survival did not mark an end so much as a transfer to another form of suffering. Their bodies had to be repaired. Burns, ulcers, infections, kidney damage, immersion injuries, malnutrition, and psychological shock all demanded reckoning. Some recovered physically with surprising resilience. The mind, less visible, often took longer. For Captain McVeigh, the next phase was ruinous. Rather than treat the disaster as a compound failure of intelligence, procedure, communication, and command culture, the Navy sought a more concentrated explanation. Institutions under stress often crave a single human figure onto whom complexity can be pinned. McVeigh was available. He had made a decision about zigzagging. That decision once isolated from its context and surrounded by grief, became the hinge on which blame would turn. He was court-martialed in December 1945. One charge, that he had failed to order abandoned ship in time, collapsed under scrutiny. The second, that he had endangered his vessel by not zigzagging, remained. It remained despite the fact that his orders had given him discretion. It remained despite the broader failures that had left the ship unescorted and unseen. Most tellingly, it remained despite the testimony of Commander Hashimoto himself, who said that zigzagging would not have prevented the attack. Hashimoto had been in the best position to know. It made no difference. McVeigh was convicted. McVeigh's punishment was mostly symbolic, but it marked him for life. Though he retired as a rear admiral, many blamed him for the disaster, and cruel letters from grieving families followed him for years. In 1968, overwhelmed by guilt and public condemnation, he took his own life. For a long time, that seemed to be the end of the story, but survivors kept speaking, and in the 1990s, a student named Hunter Scott helped revive the case through careful research. Their efforts led Congress and the Navy to re-examine what happened. In 2001, Captain McVeigh was officially exonerated. The wreck of the Indianapolis, discovered in 2017 deep in the Philippine Sea, remains a war grave and a stark reminder of both the disaster and the injustice that followed. More than a story of loss, it is also a story of endurance, courage, and the long fight to set the record straight.